Alrighty, folks, welcome back. It's good to see everybody. I hope you had a good spring break. Hello to the people in the online shell as well. So some organizational things that we need to talk about. It's that point in the semester, right, where it's going to go usually pretty fast from this point on. And so we have one more exam and then a final paper. And, of course, the discussion boards. They'll be rolled out on an as-needed basis. I want to have the flexibility to release them based on how the discussions in class go. So sometimes it'll be more than a week or so before you get a new one, depending. But in any case, I'm in the process of doing the updated schedule, trying to figure out what I want to do at the last quarter of the course. As I look at the articles in the anthology that I'm using this time, I'm not as happy as I was with the other anthology. So there may be some changes made there. Also putting together the rubric for the final paper, as well as a list of paper topics. So when it comes to the paper, you can choose from the things I'm going to have. That's easy. But my sense is that people write a better paper when it's on something that you're really excited about and you're interested in. Now, some of you have already talked with me about topics and things that you'd like to think about, and I encourage you to do that. I'm happy to give you some references and talk more if we need to. So as far as what's fair game, you can take a look through the anthology at the selections in there. I'm going to list some more stuff for you in the thing that I'm going to put together and put online. But it's never too soon to go ahead and start. I haven't decided exactly in terms of the page, how many pages yet. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 7, 6 to 8. That seems reasonable to me. So that's not enough space to really take on a whole lot of things, and better, I think, to try to nail 1 or 2 points in a really solid way than to make a bunch of sort of sweeping claims about epistemology that you can't really back up. So all of this will be in the rubric as well for you to think about. As far as the calendar goes, it looks like the second exam is supposed to release next week. And I would like to stay on track with that if I can, and I think we'll be able to. Obviously, it's not going to cover the most recent stuff we're talking about. It'll be a little bit behind the curve, but that's okay. So it'll be the same format as before. I'll give you a week or a week and a half to get that done. If you have questions about it once it's released, by all means, email me or see me. So questions from you guys about any of the sort of organizational stuff, business stuff. There's not a required revision because this isn't a writing intensive course, but past experience leads me to think that pretty much everybody's better off doing a rough draft. So I encourage you to do that, and once I get all the stuff posted and put out there on Canvas, you can go ahead and begin work on it. You've still got plenty of time, but it pays to start sooner rather than later with these kind of things. Right. So questions from you guys about any of that sort of stuff before we get back into it?
So the test is going to be released next week?
Yeah, I'm thinking probably Sunday or Monday, yeah. So it would be due the following week or a week and a half later. I'll figure out a timetable for you. But it'll be the same format as before, probably 2 questions, maybe choose probably 2 rather than 3, and roughly 2 to 3 pages per question. Again, I prefer not to have you feel like you've got to pad your answers or your discussion board post or your final paper, because we both know that that's not really what it's all about. But at the same time, it does often take more than you might think to really make the point you want to make, and sometimes more explanation is better. I think there's a tendency to take it for granted that I'm the one reading the papers, and so I already should know all this stuff, which of course I do, but the point is for you to demonstrate to me that you know it, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. In the past, occasionally you'll get an answer that's just really short, a paragraph, and that's not going to be sufficient. So as far as the discussion post, many of you have already posted on the latest one, which is what we're going to start talking about today, skepticism. I've been reading those, and I appreciate them. I encourage you, if you haven't done that already, to do so, because it'll go into next time at least, I'm sure. Gives me food for thought and helps me sort of see where people are at in terms of their understanding. Of course, it's easy to write a discussion post that's just kind of agreeing with other people and patting each other on the back, and I understand that, but really the point of these things is to challenge you to think through what you've read right? So just because Feldman wrote the book doesn't mean he's right on everything. He's a human being. He's fallible. He makes mistakes like everybody else. And so you might think that there's a point somewhere in the chapter where you disagree with him, and you could take him to task for that and try to support it with an argument, which is what it's really all about. Or perhaps you think one of the views that he objects to or criticizes is better than he says it is, and you want to try to defend that view. I think those are worthwhile discussion posts to put out there. It's food for thought for other people. And in terms of disagreeing with your classmates, that's also part of what this is about. But of course, there's a polite way to disagree, and then there's a sort of adversarial, argumentative way to do it, and we're looking for the former, not the latter. So I encourage you to keep up with that. That's an important part of your grade. I think 25% of your total grade will be your discussion contributions. And while I've said I'll give partial credit to late post, partial credit's less than ideal. So it's better to stay on track. Better for you, better for me, for everybody. Alrighty. So the plan for today and next time is to try to get as far as we can through Chapter 6. So he does skepticism in two parts, Part 1 and Part 2, starting in Chapter 6 here. And so this is a little bit of a shift, right? We're changing streams. It's worth taking stock for a moment in where we've been and where we're headed. So we started off with this sort of grand enterprise, a bunch of different questions about knowledge. What is knowledge? Can we ever really have any knowledge? Can we formulate a rule or principle or a set of these things that would help us do better at attaining knowledge? And a host of other related epistemological questions, but those were three big ones. And we've been sort of focused for the first 5 chapters on thinking about what knowledge is, right? We talked about the JTB analysis. We talked about the Gettier problem, the Gettier counterexamples. We looked at some different ways to try to rescue the traditional analysis, and then we looked at several proposals for how to fix it up with a fourth condition, right? Then we turned to a pretty intense and detailed discussion of evidentialist approaches to knowledge and justification. Obviously, that's the approach that Feldman and Earl Coney and a handful of other people advocate, but as he points out, it's not the only approach, and certainly nowadays it seems like there's a trend toward these non-evidentialist approaches. But in the section on evidentialism, we talked about foundationalism and coherence theory, classical foundationalism, and then a sort of moderate alternative, little less extreme. And we talked about the coherence theory, and we looked at objections and problems for all of these views. Then we focused our attention on these non-evidentialist approaches, right? And we discussed 4 of those: the causal theory, right? And then nose extracting theory, Goldman's reliabilism, which is sort of the successor to the causal theory, and then finally Plantinga's proper functionalism. So that gets us up to where we're at right now, and sort of turning the page to the next question, the second question of the 3 big ones that I started off with, which is, can we ever really know anything? So hopefully this is something that's interesting to you, and you have some thoughts on this, because I'd be curious to hear what people have to say. It's hard for me not to be interested in skepticism. I mean, obviously this is my area, this is my field, epistemology, so of course I like it. And I got interested in it a long time ago when I first read Descartes' Meditations and was struck by how similar his predicament, as he describes it, is to the one I was in at the time, and I guess in some ways still am. You know, Descartes begins by reflecting on the fact that for most of his life he's taken it for granted that he's known all these different things, only to finally get to a point where he's got some time on his hands and can sort of sort it all out, and realizes that actually a lot of the things he thought he knew, he was wrong about. He was mistaken, right? And we can all relate to that. And it's just everyday life, whether it's a mundane matter, right? Like getting the movie time wrong, or thinking you've got more money in your checking account than you do, or some really big thing, right? Like getting a medical diagnosis wrong, or thinking you know some fact about something really important and ending up being wrong about that. So Descartes' predicament stuck with me, and as I said, still does. And so it's not hard for me to find myself wondering when people make claims, do they know? Do they really know what they're talking about? And if so, how do they know? Right? What justifies them? So Feldman starts off this chapter, right, with just a kind of general discussion of what skepticism is. And obviously, if you've got questions right off the bat, I'd rather hear those. But if not, then we can kind of go through this, and maybe along the way people will have some thoughts or questions. So clearly skepticism means different things to different people. One thing I should say at the outset is that for a lot of folks, it carries a kind of negative connotation. And Feldman doesn't talk much about this, but you might have experienced this as well, right? In everyday, I mean, the words, taken from ordinary language, from everyday life. And so it comes with whatever baggage and associations these words already have antecedently. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about somebody being a skeptic or being skeptical or stop being so skeptical or whatever, right? With a kind of disparaging sort of tone. I'm not exactly sure what's going on there, other than that there does seem to maybe be a little bit of a bias, if you will, against people who want to keep asking why to questions, right? But the kind of skepticism that we're interested in, philosophical skepticism, which goes back to antiquity, right, isn't intended to have any of those kinds of associations. As far as I think about skepticism philosophically, it's a live option. It's a real possibility that skeptics are right, at least about certain limited claims that they might make and certain challenges. And even if you think that they're not right and you're anti-skeptical for the most part, then, as Feldman stresses throughout the chapter, the arguments demand some sort of a response. It's not enough, I don't think, to just say, well, you're being skeptical and I'm out of here. Clearly you're wrong. I know that I have hands and then I'm in a room with other people or, whatever. Of course, we all, in everyday life, we take that for granted, right? Which sort of seems to be Hume's point, if you're someone who's interested in the history of philosophy, this idea, and Hume's remembered famously for his sort of skeptical stance on a lot of different things, but at the same time he turns back around and says, but we have to keep in mind or remember that we're human beings, we're animals, and we're creatures of habit and of expectation, and we can't help but act as if all of these different things, cause and effect, a substantial self, knowledge of inductive knowledge and justification, that all these things are real. So even Hume sort of does a kind of interesting move there. So I think these arguments need some sort of response, whichever side you're on. So what is skepticism exactly then? Well, for us it's going to be this idea that we don't know or aren't justified in believing many of the things, some class of things typically, right, that we think we do. So skeptics deny what anti-skeptics claim to know. Now, there's different kinds of skepticism, right? So global skepticism, which isn't usually the topic, would be the claim that we don't know anything, right, at all. Just completely unrestricted. There is no knowledge. And you might immediately wonder, isn't that view going to be self-refuting, which gets talked about in the chapter. Most interesting kinds of skepticism, I think, have typically been of this latter sort, though, right? Local skepticism, where there's some particular class of knowledge claims, things that people think they know, right? And skeptics challenge our knowledge to these claims. As we'll see, that part of what's interesting is the nature of the challenge. What exactly is it that skeptics are claiming we need but don't have, or should be able to do but can't do? And a different project, of course, is convincing skeptics that they're wrong. So one sort of thing is trying to convert the erstwhile skeptic out of his or her skepticism and into some sort of anti-skeptical stance. And that may be interesting to some people, but it's not been my main interest or focus. I'm more concerned with trying to diagnose and understand how these skeptical arguments work, these challenges that are formulated as a set of premises leading to a conclusion that says you don't know, by the way, these things that you think you know. So local skepticism, you pick some class or some targeted group of claims, and I suspect that all of us, if we had the time and wanted to do it, could come up with, right, think of some class of things that we think we know, but or that we're skeptical of, rather. So you might be a skeptic about being visited by extraterrestrials. Maybe you think, yeah, there's life elsewhere in the galaxy, but we're not being visited by anything like that for various reasons, right? Maybe the distances or speeds or whatever would be involved. You might be a skeptic about various paranormal claims. People often make those, right? Involving clairvoyance or telepathy, or ESP of some sort. You might say, well, nobody knows any of those claims to be true. Again, a variety of different examples. Feldman gives one involving desert skepticism, right? So pick any giant desert anywhere on the earth and pick some number, right, of grains of sand, and then probably you're skeptical that anybody could know that there's that number of grains of sand in that desert. Yeah.
Something that, like, I kind of, it's a little bit off topic, but who's the onus of truth? Like, who's the onus of, like, responsibility for proving it? Like, something like paranormal, for example.
Yeah.
Is it, like, say that I'm skeptical about paranormal,
Yeah.
telepathic, power or something like that?
Yeah.
Is the onus of truth on me to refute that, or would they say that, that's your job to prove me wrong? Or is it their job to prove it right?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Corey. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so a lot of, and skepticism often ends up in this place, right, where there's these burden of proof kind of thing being shifted back and forth. More, I think, in popular discussions than in professional philosophical treatments of skepticism. I think there the different parties to the debate kind of understand what the ground rules are and what's appropriate dialectically, right, in terms of the back and forth. But certainly in everyday life, if you're out on the web and you're in various, sites reading what people are saying, blogs with responses or whatever, and you get, and it's, with religious matters and moral matters, social, political topics, there's a lot of this back and forth, jockeying for position. So, I mean, the way I think about it is just figure out what the claim in question is, and then consider whether your total evidence supports believing it, suspending judgment about it, or disbelieving it, right? So if suppose you've got a paranormal believer, right, someone who thinks that they do have, in fact, telepathic powers or clairvoyant capabilities, they presumably, if they want to claim to know that or be justified in believing it, then they ought to be able to produce some evidence for thinking that it's true, right? So, I mean, or give us some reasons, construct the argument, give me the premises leading to the conclusion. I mean, that's what I'd like to see. Now, again, in popular discussions, people don't usually do that. So I don't know if that helps answer the question of how I think about the burden of proof sort of thing working. I worry a lot of times when that comes up because it often ends up being an argument stopper. In other words, one side says, well, you can't prove it. And the other side says, well, you can't prove it's not true. It's like, okay, cool. So what are we going to do? Just all go home and we can't hang out? I mean, I don't really know what more you can say. So I think this idea of part of the hang-up there has to do with this concept of proof, that people sort of lean heavily on that notion. They throw it out there kind of loosely, and it's supposed to do a bunch of work. And to me, it really doesn't. It's not that helpful. I mean, I think about proof as really being the sort of thing that can only be done in math and logic. So outside of those areas, it's kind of a misuse of language, I think, to put too much weight on what you can or can't prove. I can't prove that the cup's on the table. I have every good reason for thinking that it's true. I think I know that the cup is on the table. And I think I can produce some arguments or reasons. I could cite some evidence to try to get you convinced of that if you're a skeptic about these kind of claims, which, by the way, would be external world skepticism. And we'll talk about that. That's one of the more interesting ones because it is so provocative, right? I mean, it's not hard to get people skeptical about maybe morality or moral claims or religious claims. People will be skeptical about those many times. Social and political ones, you can find folks that will argue with you, right? But not too many people are skeptical that you can have knowledge of your immediate environment based on sense perception. So those arguments are really provocative because if we can't figure out what's gone wrong and you want to be rational, then it looks like you're committed to accepting the conclusion, which is that you don't know that you have a body right now. You don't know that you're sitting. You don't know that you're in a room with other people. So external world skepticism is one that's, for me at least, kind of fun to think about how should we respond to that kind of skepticism. But as far as this back and forth and jockeying for position. The way I think about it is, as a anti-skeptic, I make a claim to know some fact or other, and then if challenged, if a skeptic says, well, how do you know? Then I try to produce some sort of satisfactory response, and we go from there. Now they may, and different skeptics respond in different ways. So somebody might say, well, how do you know that? To your first justification, what's the justification? And you're off to the races down, a possible infinite regress. Or they might stop you and say, but what about, or that's not good enough, or why would you think that? So it could go a number of different ways, but to me the idea is to try to engage the skeptic rather than sort of say, well, I'm digging in my heels, I know it, and you're just wrong, and then them saying, well, no, you don't know it, and going back and forth that way. But I think it's a good question. I don't know if it helps much. A little bit, maybe. So we need to distinguish the strength of various kinds of skeptical claims. And Feldman talks a little bit about this early on. So one kind of idea is to get clear on what it is exactly that the skeptic's claiming. The strongest kind of skepticism would presumably be a claim that it's impossible for anyone to know facts of a certain sort, right? And he gives some examples. So on the bottom of 199, he says, it's impossible for anyone to know anything about the future. So future is always fun to talk about. That's one people like to, right? Because it raises lots of hard questions. Many of us want to believe that the future isn't settled yet, that it's open. That, and part of the motivation, presumably, is that we can make a difference. Our choices matter, and that what we do affects things. The idea that nothing you do could make any difference to the future outcome of some state of affairs seems kind of, it's kind of bleak, right? So for those reasons, among others, you might think that you can't really ever know anything about the future until it's happened, and then it's not the future, right? Or you might think that there's some kind of built-in inconsistency or incoherence or contradiction into the idea of knowing about the future. Once you understand exactly what that would be, you'll see that it's kind of like trying to make a round square, or have a married bachelor exist. You can't do those, in part because they're conceptual claims that involve necessary truths about the concepts, right? So maybe future knowledge would come to that. I don't know. If you're interested in, and again, as I've said throughout the semester, I try to throw things out along the way for people to think about. If that interests you and you want to write about it, then let me know, and we'll try to figure out some essay or two that you could take a look at and analyze and see what you think. That might be something fun to discuss. So this idea of it being impossible for you to know, that's the strongest kind of claim, right? But there's weaker forms of skepticism, which I think are more common. The next one that he talks about is this idea that nobody's able to know it, right? Which is in some ways maybe more interesting because there it leaves open the possibility that there could be truths about the matter, but they're just beyond our capacities to know. From an epistemic point of view, we're never in a good enough situation to be able to lay claim to really knowing. We'll probably talk about this a little later too, but if you're hung up on this idea of skepticism about knowledge, you can also think about skepticism about justification. In some ways even more worrying or worrisome, right? Because somebody might say, well, maybe I can't know it, but surely I'm justified in my beliefs, right? Leaving it open that maybe the proposition's not true and you'd fall short of knowledge because you fall short of the truth condition. But I think even more sort of challenging kind of skepticism is one that attacks the propriety of our reasons. Are they good enough, right? Do they pass muster? Are they up to the right standard to count as adequate or sufficient justification for making this claim, for this belief? That's a different thing altogether. So we've got both of those here. I think the second category is in some ways the more interesting one involving nobody being able to do it, but it not necessarily being impossible, just that we can't do it. And then a weaker one still at the very bottom of 110, this idea that just in fact nobody knows these things. Not that it wouldn't be possible, but again that we just, as a matter of course, we don't have that kind of knowledge, right? So the next thing we want to talk about, well, let me stop for a second and see if people have thoughts or questions about any of this so far.
Yeah, so no one's able to know anything. Does that include like conceptual truths? Like, so I can still say because like I could say in the future there is not going to be a Mary Bachelor.
Yeah.
And so is that only apply to conceptual, or is that just like,
Those, well, I mean, presumably this may not help, but thanks, I appreciate it, Corey. That's a good one. So yeah, the claims about the conceptual truths, those are necessarily true. So they're either timelessly true or they're true at each time. So presumably, it's not. How can I say it? Seems to me like it's not really a claim about the future. I mean, it's not satisfying. It's a different claim about. If it is a claim about the future, then it seems importantly different than one like, I know that it's going to rain tomorrow.
Yeah.
I mean, how could anybody know that it's going to rain tomorrow right now? Short of an omniscient being, which we're not worrying about right now. Thinking about human knowledge. So yeah, in the future, no one will be able to know that 2 + 2 = 5. Because you can't know that because it can't be true, and so it could never count as knowledge. So, and again, part of the puzzle with this stuff about the future involves thinking about tensed propositions and what do you do with the time, right? So philosophy of time's its own can of worms as well. Is that?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that like there's a distinction between like a necessary truth and like saying something like, oh, it's going to rain tomorrow?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So the necessary truths are going to be either they're timelessly true because they're true in all possible worlds, all times and places. So they're either they're outside of any kind of time worries, or if you want to, because I don't really want to have to take a stand on how to think about tensed propositions. There's some debate about that. So there's some different ways in the philosophy of language to try to deal with, claims about embedded temporal indices within propositions. And some of this ends up getting you committed to views about time itself, which seems to be sort of separate from this worry about necessary truths and how to think about them. I mean, if you believe in necessary truths at all, then you've got to say something, right? They're either true tenselessly, or if you want to make them somehow tied to times, like maybe you think the time just has to be somehow included in any propositional claim, then they're true at every time. Sort of analogous to whether you want to, how you want to understand divine eternality. So according to traditional Western theism, God is eternal. What does that mean? So one view would be that God's just outside of time altogether. Sort of, you've got the temporal order, right? So the beginning, suppose it has a beginning and an end, and God's sort of outside of that framework, sort of viewing it all from a different vantage point. But another view would be that God's temporally eternal. So still able to causally interact with the temporal order to perform some sort of interventional thing or whatever, right? But it's still in time. So that's kind of what I'm trying to sort of dance around there. Because it seems like there ought to be some account of necessary truths either way, unless you just want to give up on the whole idea of necessity. And there are people that are skeptical about real necessity. But most philosophers, I think, take the idea seriously. The idea of modality is taken pretty seriously. But I think it's a good question. I see what you're trying to do. I mean, you get a claim about the future, but then embedded within it is a kind of necessary truth or an impossible claim or something like that. Yeah, that's cool. Other thoughts or questions up to this point? Let me move us along a little bit then. So this is important, this part. So it's easy to get kind of mixed up on exactly what it is that skeptics are up to when they challenge your claim to knowledge. And what I mean by that is that it seems like a skeptic could be challenging your claim because they don't think there are any truths of the sort, right? So if there just aren't any truths about the matter, and knowledge entails truth, which we know it does now because you're all experts in JTB and the Gettier problem, then nobody's going to be able to know for that reason. But another kind of skeptical challenge attacks the justification condition. So when you think about the three traditional conditions, right, knowledge or justification, belief, and the truth condition, either the truth or justification condition could be the proper target. And so you can compare these two here at the bottom, thinking about ethical claims for a second, since those are controversial and people disagree a lot and like to think about this stuff. So one idea is that there are ethical truths, claims about what's right and wrong, morally permissible, impermissible, and so on, but that we just can't know what those are. So truths about morality, but not knowable. And then you'd have to find out, well, what's the reason why they're not knowable? That's different than saying, well, look, there just aren't any truths about right and wrong. And so obviously you can't know any nobody could ever correctly be said to have moral knowledge or ethical knowledge. What's the difference? Well, and you might wonder, well, why would anybody be inclined toward either of these? And we can think about it for a second. I mean, this isn't a seminar on ethical skepticism, or moral skepticism, but it's certainly a topic that gets discussed a lot. It sort of crosses over between epistemology and moral philosophy. So this first view that there are truths about right and wrong, but we just can't know what they are, that's compatible with a kind of moral realism. So moral realism is the idea that our moral claims should be treated on a par with our everyday ordinary language claims. So when I say that the cup is on the table, just to take a non-philosophical, non-moral example, right, that claim gets treated just at face value. That in order for it to be true, there has to be a cup, and there has to be a table, and they have to have this certain relation to one another, right? That's a kind of realism about common sense perceptual claims. Now, somebody might come along and dispute that for any number of different reasons, right? They might think that, like, you're dreaming, or you're a victim of Descartes' evil demon, or they might say, well, look, physics tells us that nothing's ever really touching. So how could one thing ever be on another thing? And moreover, physics tells us that this cup isn't what you think it is, and this table isn't what you think it is. Everything just becomes, very, very bizarre at that point. What are these objects then? So that'd be one kind of view. And the first one here, 3, is compatible with that. There are folks out there that might incline toward this. They might say, look, when you say that it's morally wrong, the capital punishment's morally wrong, that statement is intended to express something that's either true or false, and it should be treated the same way as the cup is on the table. The problem is that while almost no one's going to deny that we can know stuff about cups and tables, a lot of people might be concerned that you can't ever really know claims about morality, right? Why is that? Again, pick from a host of different reasons. That there's endless disagreement, that the experts don't agree, that for any good argument in favor of it, there's an equally good argument for not doing it. So any of those kind of reasons would work. That's different, though, than what 4 is saying, right? That there just simply aren't any ethical truths whatsoever. Why would somebody be inclined to think that? That's a more radical kind of view. This is sometimes called moral anti-realism, and it's tied with a view known as non-cognitivism. So cognitivism and moral realism kind of tend to go together. They're not the same thing. Cognitivism is this idea that moral statements do express truth values, that they can be evaluated in terms of truth and falsity. Moral realism, just again, the idea that moral claims be treated on a par with ordinary everyday claims, that there's nothing funky or special going on within the language there. The second idea, though, is more radical, that there just simply aren't any truths about right and wrong. That's a kind of anti-realism and also a kind of non-cognitivism. In other words, people that advocate this view then usually go on to defend a theory of what's really going on with those statements. And they'll say something like, well, even though the surface grammar makes you think that they're meant to express a claim that's either true or false, you're being misled by the grammar, and that the way they really work is you're just giving voice to some sort of sentiment. In other words, claims about morality are sort of like cheering for your favorite team in a sporting event. So boo, hooray, that kind of thing. This is sort of the boo, hooray theory that gets discussed occasionally. That'd be one idea. Another view might be that, well, look, I mean, all you're really doing is you're sort of expressing preferences, you know. Now, again, they'd be able to be true or false, but they certainly would be concealed within the surface grammar, right? That's not immediately clear. It looks like you're talking, when I say capital punishment is wrong, just to use an example, is always morally wrong, seems like I'm talking about capital punishment and not just what I believe or think about it. But, again, you'd have to tell a story, and different folks have. So there are some views out there, emotivism and prescriptivism among others, that try to walk that line. So here's another sort of example of what's going on here, just to see if people are getting it. Feldman discusses this on 112 and 113, and since we've come across this kind of example before involving the ancients, and I think it is provocative. People seem to like to think about it because it raises this sort of specter of how we know we're not in the same situation right now with respect to a lot of the things we think we know. And given that we do, it seems a lot find out we're wrong, that we do make mistakes, and we actually find this out. It's hard not to be sensitive to the idea. So the quote at the top here, if you say that the ancients didn't know that the earth was flat because they were wrong about it, then you must also say that we don't know that the earth is approximately round because we might be wrong about it. And so we've got two arguments that he reconstructs just as a sort of stylistic thing or pedagogical thing for when you're writing your papers. You'll notice that both of these arguments, argument 1 and 2, and my numbering is different than Feldman's just to make it easier, but both of these arguments are missing a premise. In other words, they're ill-formed. So if you think about arguments in terms of whether they're well-formed or ill-formed, and the well-formed ones are either deductive and valid or they're inductive and cogent, which is the terminology I've sort of been using, I like it when in a paper, if you're reconstructing arguments, which I hope you will be, or in a discussion post, right, or for your next exam, to actually walk me through that. Again, that's that kind of stuff that, yeah, I already know it, but I want to know that you know it. So it may seem a little redundant, but, you know, I would point out along the way that, oh, by the way, argument 1 and argument 2, each of them has one premise and a conclusion. It's going to be real hard for an argument with one premise and a conclusion to ever be well-formed unless it's a circular argument, right? The only one that's ever going to be valid that's like that is going to look like this, P, therefore P, right? Not interesting. So, and he does this on purpose here because he wants to call attention to the missing premise in each one because they're going to end up being different, right? So argument 1 is that the ancients' belief that the earth was flat was false. Therefore, the ancients didn't know that the earth was flat. And the second one is our belief that the earth is round might be false. Therefore, we don't know that the earth is round. And what he does is he says, let's take these two arguments and then we'll come up with a meta-argument. In other words, it's an argument about arguments. And the claim from the first passage up there seems to be that, well, look, if you think that the argument about the ancients isn't any good, then you're committed to thinking that the argument about us isn't any good either, or is good, right? Whichever way you want to take it. So if argument 1's sound, then argument 2 is sound. Argument 1 looks like it's sound, so it's valid with all true premises. Just get the terminology right. Therefore, argument 2 is sound. So what do people think without looking at what he says? You can probably figure it out if you just think about, focus in on the missing premise that would have to, what premise would have to be added to each of these arguments, to 1 and 2, in order to make them well-formed. Right? So what's going wrong here? Get you guys to help me out and tell me.
Yeah, I'll play the game.
Okay, please. Thanks, Cor. You're getting all the participation points today. Yeah. Hey, it's good. It's fine with me.
It seems to me that the argument 1 and argument 2's premises are just really different, and you can't, like, you could make argument 1 sound by just adding the Earth is approximately round, like as your P2, and then therefore the ancients didn't know that. But if you, but that doesn't seem to really work with argument 2. Or we call it the meta argument. The meta
argument. Well, yeah. But I'm just trying to figure out, I mean, you can try to just figure out what premise would have to be added, right? Which is sort of what he does. I mean, you'll see that there's a difference between them, right? What's the shift? What's going on? Because this is an easy thing to have go wrong in a lot of these discussions and debates with skeptics. Part of this is about getting clear on exactly what the structure of the skeptical arguments are, right? Does anybody sort of see the shift that's happening here, right? So we think, right, from our point of view, we know that their view was false, right? But in the second argument, it just says our view might be false. So there's a difference between its being false and, moreover, known to be false, which we do know that, right? And some things may be being false or could turn out to be or might be, and that makes all the difference. So you can see down here at the bottom, this is essentially what Feldman's trying to bring out in this section. I was rereading it, though, and I thought, well, it seems clear, but sometimes things seem clear to me and they're not clear to folks, so it could be worth talking about. So yeah, here's the difference, right? If in terms of the premise you'd have to add to each of these. So if S's belief is false, then S doesn't know that P. Versus if S's belief might be false, then S doesn't know that P. And if you're puzzling over, well, I don't really see what difference it makes. I mean, they both sound bad to me. If it's false, then you don't know it, and if it might be false, then you don't know it. If you're in that place, then maybe you're a skeptic. Maybe you're going to find some of these skeptical arguments that I'm about to show kind of appealing, which is okay too, because they are. I mean, that's part of why we're still talking about it, right? It's trying to figure out what's really going wrong here, what the problem is. So, what do people think? People see the difference here between it's being false and it's possibly being false? Hopefully. Yeah, cool. All right. So, on to a discussion of some of these arguments. And there's, lots of these. Most of these, by the way, are sort of examples of modern skepticism rather than skepticism from antiquity. So there's Pyrrhonian skepticism. If you're interested in ancient philosophy, you could think about that, and I can give you some sources. But most of what he's doing here are kinds of skeptical arguments that are inspired by Descartes and folks of that ilk. All right. So here's the first one for us to think about. And just to kind of set the stage a little bit, this starts over on 114. So anybody want to read this awesome passage from Descartes' Meditation 1? Any Descartes fans here? Better be. Just kidding. This is one of my favorites. This is the famous dream passage from Meditation 1. And many of you have already seen this because you've taken my intro course, but others of you haven't. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Appreciate it.
At the same time, I must remember that I am a man, and that consequently frequently I'm in the habit of sleeping, and in my dreams repeating to myself the same things, or sometimes even less probable things, and be those that are insane in their waking moments. This moment, it does indeed seem to me that it is with eyes awake that I am looking at this paper, that this head which I move is not asleep. It is deliberately with a set purpose that I extend my hand and pursue it. What happens in sleep does not appear so clear nor so distinct as does all this. But in thinking over this, I remind myself that on many occasions I have in sleep been deceived by similar illusions, and in dwelling carefully on this reflection I see so manifestly there are no certain indications by which we can clearly distinguish wakefulness from sleep, that I am lost in astonishment.
Awesome. Thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, so this is the dream passage. And as I say, many of you have probably seen it before. A number of different ways to reconstruct it. I'll show you this version that Feldman gives, and then another version that is similar to his transmissibility argument in terms of its style and the use of a closure principle. But part of the art of reconstructing these things is striking a balance between being true to the author's intent and also being faithful and charitable, and making the argument as good as you can make it on their behalf. So, interesting argument, the possibility of error then. So, premise one, for almost any belief any person has about the external world, that belief could be mistaken, right? Second premise, if a belief could be mistaken, then it's not a case of knowledge. Sort of appealing. So, conclusion, therefore, almost any belief a person has about the external world isn't one that they know. In other words, no one knows anything or more than very little about the external world. Now, again, this is kind of focused in on external world skepticism, and it sort of shifts around. That's one kind, as I've said, a really radical kind of skepticism. Not too many folks, even philosophers or epistemologists, are going to maybe be inclined to go that route because of the consequences of the view, right? Seems like we do know, and the standard view that we're sort of assuming for, at least for evaluative purposes, claims that we do know quite a bit about the external world. Seems unproblematic in most cases. You know that you're in a room right now with other people, that you're listening to a lecture, that you have a body, two hands, that you're seated and not standing, right? That the projector is on, and so on. So you seem to know a lot of really mundane, non-philosophical things about your immediate environment on the basis primarily of sense perception, along with, memory and other sources that would play into this full account of your knowledge right now. Let me show you another example, another reconstruction of this same passage. And again, this one looks a lot more like what he's calling transmissibility of the four that he discusses. So here's another one, drawn from specifically about the dream argument. If you know that you're listening to a lecture right now, then you know that you're not at home in bed dreaming that you're listening to a lecture, but you don't know that you're not at home in bed dreaming that you're listening to this lecture. In other words, for all you know, this could all be taking place as part of a dream. Not a very good one, of course. I'm going to add that. Got to get better dream content going. But if both of those premises are true, then it turns out that you don't know that you're listening to a lecture right now. And we'll see when we get to transmissibility that it has a kind of similar look to it. This kind of argument turns on, show you this, turns on a version of the closure principle, which we talked a little bit about when we discussed Nozick and tracking, right? So if S knows that P and P implies Q and comes to believe Q on the basis of spotting this connection, then S knows Q. And you can do the same thing for justification if you want to talk about that instead of knowledge. But this is one of those transference kind of ideas. And most of, again, this has all changed a little bit in the past 20, 25 years. There was a sort of period where a lot of folks got excited about the idea of denying closure. And using that as I think you asked a question at one point, like what would be the motivation for ever getting rid of a principle like this because it seems so plausible. just a kind of an epistemologically regimented version of modus ponens. If we can't get that much, then we're in trouble, right? Why would anybody do that? Well, part of the appeal was to be able to sort of have your cake and eat it too, because you're trying to balance out these two ideas. On the one hand, it seems pretty clear that I know I'm in a room with other people, but the conclusion, right, that I know that I'm not a brain in a vat somewhere being fed all of my experiences from a computer that's programmed to simulate all of this, how could I ever know that? My experiences would be exactly the same. And all the evidence, all the reasons that I have, it seems, for my belief that I'm in a room with other people, is just the experiences that I'm having. If the experiences are the same in the two cases, then it looks like I either know in both cases or I don't know in both cases. But in the VAT hypothesis case, it's false, so there's no way for me to know it. So I must not know it in this case either. That's powerful, and that's worrisome, right? So let me show you. Well, let me just put this one back up and see. Since this is the one Feldman uses, I'll stick with his. And see whether we want to go through all four arguments and then come back to them one at a time and have you guys talk about them. Or if we want to talk about each one and then move on. We can go either way. Want to see them all first? Or you want to talk about it as we go? What do you think about this one? Is everybody convinced? Anthony, yes.
Seems kind of similar to the certainty
Mm-hmm.
argument. I guess what's different?
And that was one you liked, right? And I was reading the post. I think you said, yeah. I agree with what you said in your post, that there's an appeal that sometimes the simplest ones are the most kind of, they grab you, right? Because it's, both of the premises look, it's two premises and a conclusion. There's not a lot of places to go if you want to get out of it, right? I probably shouldn't have let you guys read at the end of the chapter where he talks about fallibilism, because I suspect he's already convinced everybody of fallibilism, and that's why people aren't that excited about this stuff. So he should have left that off and gotten you really worried, left you hanging, thinking that you really don't know that you're in a room with other people, and you got to wait until next time to find out about fallibilism. So Feldman kind of stole my thunder here. Sorry. But in any case, yeah, Anthony. So
Yeah. I guess I was just wondering what the difference was.
between the certainty argument and this argument,
Yeah, if
well,
there was an explicit difference between the two, because it seems like they're doing essentially the same thing.
yeah, I mean, this turns on this idea of being mistaken, and the other one uses the word certain. So, I mean, is there a difference between the two? We'll talk about it, because there is a kind of part of it's just figuring out what certainty amounts to. Is it just a psychological state? And I mean, you're certain, if it's impossible for you to bring yourself to doubt, or is certainty something that's actually connected to the verific goal? In other words, to truth one way or the other. Yeah. And I mean, good question. I'll think about it some more too. But it seems to me, I mean, at least initially, my first impression is well, this is making use of the idea of you can't be mistaken. The other one's talking about whether or not you're certain. But the relevant sense of certainty just is that you can't be mistaken. So you're on the right track, I think, there. That's good. So why does he say for almost any belief about the external world? Why not just for any belief? Yeah. Yeah, the cogito. Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Yeah. So he mentions that. In response, one might wonder whether that is a belief about the external world. Because on Descartes' view, we got to remember you're also a Cartesian soul. And they don't occupy any spatio-temporal. They're not spatial. They're not located anywhere. So if what you are is a soul, then the fact that you're thinking is activity that's occurring within a non-physical substance, right? So it's still not part of the external world, right? You guys are part of my external world, right? Because you're something beyond the contents of my immediate experience. But my own reflective awareness, if I'm the kind of thing Descartes says I am, then my own reflective awareness seems to me to not count as something that's part of the external world. And so I think you're right to bring up what he says there, because he does say that. But I just think if you start to go down the rabbit hole and put in the rest of what Descartes' thinking, I wonder if on his view it turns out that he's part of the external world. I'm not sure. I don't think so. But another possibility, and I was wondering if anybody was going to say this, is that there might be propositions that one could plausibly argue are about the external world because of what they're talking about, but nevertheless they're necessarily true. So normally, another way he could have done this is he could have just said, instead of for almost any belief, he might have said for any contingent external world proposition or contingent empirical claim about the external world. The thing I'm thinking about here is something like this. Water equals H2O. Right? So that's an identity statement. And if it's a true statement, then it's necessarily true, right? Because that's the way identity works. So you can put the box in front of it. The box just means it's necessarily true that. So that's a necessary truth. If it's true not only here in the actual world, but in all possible worlds, right? But since it's talking about water, and water is a substance, and that's presumably something that exists in an external world, it's not part of the contents of my immediate sense experience, then I think you could make the case that, well, look, this is an external world claim, but it's a necessary truth, right? So there's no way a person could ever be mistaken in believing this, because any world where you believe it is also a world where it turns out to be true. Again, some of what I'm saying here turns on assumptions about the way these terms work, right? And that's details from philosophy of language. There are different views about this, but I think a lot of folks would say, well, I mean, it's an identity, and so if it's true, it's a necessity, but it took empirical work to make this connection, right? I mean, before hydrogen chemistry, we didn't know that this identity statement was true. This is an empirical discovery, even though it's an identity statement. So what does that show? Well, that shows that necessary truths and a priori truths aren't the same thing, right? Not all necessities are a priori knowable. And there might be, moreover, there might be some contingent statements, like Descartes' cogito, right? I think, that there's thinking going on and that thinking is mine. That's something that you can know a priori, presumably, if you want to be generous to the Cartesian picture. But it's not necessarily true. I might have never existed. Had my parents never met, I wouldn't exist, and I wouldn't be thinking. There wouldn't be thinking going on. So the moral of the story in the old days, hard to know how far back the old days go, but you've got the necessary statements, and you've got the analytic statements, and then the a priori statements on one side. And then you've got the contingent truths, right? And the so-called synthetic statements, and the a posteriori on the other side. And the idea was that these three sets of distinctions carved up the entire lay of the land, right? So everything that was necessarily true was also a priori knowable and was analytic. And everything that was contingent was also a posteriori. You had to use observation to get to know it or be justified in it. And it was synthetic, right? And that lasted for a long, long time. But then Kripke and Donnellon and a handful of others came along and started suggesting that it really might look more like this. You can have some of these, and you can also have some of these. And then what happened with the analytic synthetic? Well, nobody talks that way anymore. It's a bad philosophy joke. But in any case, this distinction has come under attack in the 20th century by Quine and a handful of other people. So there's not as much talk about the analytic synthetic. This is a linguistic distinction. This is a logical or metaphysical distinction. And this is an epistemological one, right? So you can see why trying to figure out how these things work out is valuable, because that cover a lot of terrain. I mean, between logic, metaphysics, language, and epistemology, you've got all the basic building blocks you need for an entire systematic philosophy. So in any case, I doubt that's Feldman's motivation for, I suspect Jamie's right, and his real concern is stuff like the cogito. But it seems to me that this could also play into it. It could be a worry along the way. All right, so what do people think about this argument? The argument's valid, right? Which means that if its premises are true, its conclusion has to be true. It also means that if you want to be rational and you don't like the conclusion, then you've got to not like at least one premise. And there's no general criticisms of arguments, so you have to pick a premise. All right? Yeah, Aaron. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so just not conflating certainty with knowledge. Yeah, giving. Right. I mean, and of course, part of the worry here is we don't want this to just turn into a game of how we're going to define these things, right? I mean, presumably, knowledge is a term that's already in use, right? We use it all the time, and it has an antecedent meaning. And so, as someone who's a fan of conceptual analysis, which is kind of falling out of favor these days, I'm inclined to think that, when we analyze a concept like knowledge, we'd like to get as close a fit as we can to what ordinary language would say, and thus have some connection to our intuitions about cases, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, well, we can just define knowledge to mean this other thing, and then we can get out of these kinds of problems. But I think there's an actual, there's real motivation for insisting that, well, no, I mean, this is the correct analysis of the concept, and ordinary language supports the idea that there's a difference between knowing something and being certain that something's true, right? Obviously, it would seem that if you're certain in the relevant respect, then you know it, but you could know something and fall short of that high standard, which sounds like what you're saying. Yeah. Cool. So, what do people think then? I mean, this argument, nobody convinced? Going to get rid of a premise? Is everybody on board to get rid of premise 2? Is that what you don't like? All right, let me show you another one. See what you think about this one. I kind of like this, the indistinguishability stuff. I think it's kind of fun to think about because it's challenging, right? I mean, if it turns out that the bulk, if not maybe all of your evidence, and at least limited to these kinds of cases of external world claims, is just your sensory experience at the moment. And I guess you get some memory in there too if you need it, but then it would seem that you have exactly the same sensory experiences in the VAT case as the real world case, and you don't know in the VAT case because it's not true, then why wouldn't it follow that you don't know in the real world case given that you have exactly the same experience, right? Does just happening to be right, is that enough? And not requiring certainty, is that enough to get it to cross over and count as knowledge? We can take a look at it here. So if a person can have knowledge on the basis of fallible evidence, then there can be cases of knowledge that are introspectively indistinguishable from cases of not. Can be cases, this should say something else, right? Cases of knowledge that are introspectively indistinguishable from cases of non-knowledge, I think, right? Look back at it and make sure we're getting it right here. There's a typo. Yeah, thanks. Got to fix that. All right. Second premise, but there can't be cases of knowledge that are introspectively indistinguishable from cases of non-knowledge. A person cannot have knowledge on the basis of fallible evidence. but all the evidence we have for any propositions about the external world is fallible. So we can't have knowledge about the external world. Interesting argument. You're shaking your head.
I think this, I would say number 3, kind of like Aaron said, like
Yeah.
it goes back to fallibilism.
But would you have said that if you hadn't already read through the end of the chapter?
Oh,
Different question, I know. I agree with you. So we can all hold hands and celebrate fallibilism later, but for now.
I mean, take fallibilism out of the equation, and I would still attack number 3.
Yeah.
Because then it goes back to that philosophy of language thing. Like, so, you're saying I have to be absolutely certain about everything,
Yeah.
and it seems to me that you can't be 100% certain about a lot of stuff we know.
So is the worry there that if we required absolute certainty, then we'd have to jettison the standard view, and we'd rather hold on to the standard view than take the skeptic seriously? I mean, because I'll play the skeptic if you want me to.
Well, I mean, I think that skepticism is healthy, but to the extent of denying anything,
Yeah.
like that seems to me it's very binary. It's either it is or it isn't. Whereas like you could say, well, yeah, I'm 99%, versus 100 or 0. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Anybody else? I mean, just to play the devil's advocate, right? As they say, the skeptic might say, "Well, look, I mean, you're just clinging desperately to the desire to have the standard view turn out to be right," and so obviously, the implications of what the skeptic's claiming are that big chunks of the standard view are going to have to be abandoned, and that's such a dire, horrible outcome that we can't embrace that. Right? And so the skeptic might say, this is just kind of clinging to your view rather in the face of a challenging reason for thinking that you don't know nearly as much as you think you do. I mean, I'm with you, of course. I agree, right? That it seems like we can have knowledge on the basis of fallible evidence, but fallibilism itself is not, out of the woods, right? Because someone might say, look, I mean, just saying to the skeptic, oh, well, all I need is fallible evidence, I don't need certainty. Then the skeptic says, well, I don't even think your fallible evidence is up to snuff. It's not good enough, right? Because for all you know, all that fallible evidence that you think is giving you knowledge is also justifying, Brian and believing that he's in the world when he's a brain in a vat. So I'm just trying to impress upon folks that, yeah, I mean, Feldman, he's a fan of fallibilism, clearly, and he's going to, that's, and I like it too. I think it's probably the right way to go, but I don't want to give it too easy a time. I want to give the skeptic their due here, so that they feel like they're not getting short shrift. So yeah, I mean, if you reject 3, then you can reject the conclusion, clearly. And the rest of these seem to be, you might think, what about 2? There can't be cases of knowledge that are introspectively indistinguishable from cases of non-knowledge. You can reject that too, right? Because there will be cases of knowledge and cases of non-knowledge that from your internal perspective, you can't tell the difference. I remember a lecture one time when I was up there where one of them was, I think it was either Rich or Earl, was saying, yeah, it's not as though cases of knowledge have a glow or something. And the person's head glows when they know, but it doesn't when they don't. I mean, from your internal perspective, it's gonna look the same either way. It would be nice if they glowed, right? If you had some sort of internally accessible, infallible indicators that every time you really knew you got it right, like truth worked. The connection between justification and truth were that close, it'd be great. Yeah, something like that. So that, I'm in one of the cases now where I'm getting it right, and I can rest safely. All right, what about the certainty argument? We'll take a look at that one. Let me see where I'm at in the chapter here. Okay, so this is one that Anthony was talking about earlier. somebody who's talked a lot about certainty is G.E. Moore. So again, if any of the stuff we're talking about piques your interest and you think, hey, I hadn't thought about that, I might want to write my final paper on that, then let me know, and I'll try to steer you to some resources so that you can take a look at it and see what you think. All right. So if S knows that P, then S is absolutely certain that P, or of P, but no one's ever absolutely certain of anything about the external world, so no one knows anything about the external world. Well, clearly it all turns on this idea that you've got to be absolutely certain, right? So if you give up one, and moreover, you might think that you could be absolutely certain of some things about the external world if it turned out that there are some necessary truths that are a posteriori than they'd be about the external world, presumably. There would take empirical work. I mean, like the water equals H2O would take empirical work, which would involve fallible steps where you could get things wrong. But once you've got the identity, it seems like that's the empirical part, and then the necessity comes along, so to speak, for free. All right. What about, I'll save this last one for next time. I'll end with that for today. Thanks, folks. I appreciate it. If you haven't done the latest discussion board, please do so I can read what you think about this. And we'll pick back up with it on Thursday. Cool.